The funeral of Obinna Nwachukwu was the most scandalous event Lagos had ever seen. The golden sun lay in a custom-made glass casket, a final, ironic choice for a man who had spent his entire life behind a transparent wall of deception. He looked peaceful, almost ethereal, in his signature black crewneck t-shirt and that thin silver chain. The Rolex on his wrist had been removed by his father earlier that morning, not as a keepsake, but as a down payment for the cartel silence during the service. The atmosphere in the massive white marquee was thick with the scent of lilies and the sharp, metallic tang of fear. The elite of Nigeria sat on one side, their faces marks of rehearsed grief, while on the other side sat the people from Obinna's other life. Funk was there, a young son dressed in a tiny black suit, his large dark brown eyes scanning the crowd for the father who would never come home. The service began with a eulogy that sounded more like a desperate defense than a tribute. Chief Nwachukwu stood at the podium, his voice cracking not from sadness, but from the sheer effort of maintaining the facade. "My son was a visionary," he declared, his eyes darting toward the back of the tent where the cartel members stood like statues. "He was a man of integrity, a pillar of this community." A low murmur rippled through the pews. Everyone knew. The headlines that morning had been brutal: the Tech Prince's Ponzi Palace, and Lekki's Golden Boy, secret lives and stolen millions. The scandalous nature of his death had stripped away the prestige, leaving only the raw, ugly truth. Adogo sat in the front row, her head bowed, clutching the journal she had found in his sneakers. She hadn't read past the first page, she was too afraid of what else her perfect boy had written about her. The emotional tension snapped when the concerned citizen, Segun, walked up to the casket. He didn't offer a prayer. He leaned over the glass and whispered loud enough for the microphone to catch, "You almost made it, Obi. One more week and you would have been in Lisbon." The crowd gasped. The revelation of the one-way ticket was the final blow to the family's narrative of a devoted son. He wasn't just a fraud, he was an escape artist who had failed his final act. Funk stood up, her voice ringing out over the soft organ music. "He wasn't your pillar. He was a man who was drowning, and all of you just kept asking him to swim faster. You didn't love him, you loved what he could buy for you." Her outburst was the catalyst for a chaotic, tear-filled shouting match that turned the funeral into a battlefield of accusations and bitter regret. As the pallbearers lifted the glass casket, a sudden gust of wind tore through the marquee, flipping the pages of the journal Adogo held. A loose photograph fell out, a picture of Obinna standing in front of a modest house in Lisbon, a genuine, unburdened smile on his face. On the back, in his neat handwriting, it said, "The only place I can finally breathe." He had never intended to take his parents with him. He had intended to leave the death, the lies, and the golden sun persona behind in the Lagos heat. The sadness was no longer for his death, but for the tragic realization that nobody in that tent had ever actually met the real Obinna. They were mourning a character in a movie that had ended in a horrific crash. As the procession moved toward the cemetery, the rain began to fall again, washing away the expensive makeup and the carefully curated lies of the Nwachukwu legacy. The red earth of the Ikoyi cemetery swallowed the glass casket, a final, transparent prison for a man who had lived behind windows. As the first shovel of dirt hit the surface with a hollow thud, the sky above Lagos broke open in a biblical downpour. The elite fled to their armored SUVs, their perfumes mixing with the scent of wet clay, leaving the Nwachukwu family standing alone in the mud. Adogo didn't move. She stared at the grave, her expensive black lace soaked through, clinging to her skin like a second, heavier grief. The journal in her hand was now a pulp of ink and ruined paper, the secrets blurring into illegible blue streaks. Beside her, Chief Nwachukwu looked diminished, his shoulders slumped as if the weight of the mahogany tree surrounding them had settled on his spine. The Rolex was gone, the reputation was shattered, and the golden sun was now just a debt that could never be repaid. The scandalous twist came not from the grave, but from the gates. As the family turned to leave, they were met by a fleet of black sedans, not the cartel, but the Economic and Financial Crimes Commission. The concerned citizen, Segun, stood beside the lead investigator, a cold smirk playing on his lips. "It wasn't just a Ponzi scheme, Chief," Segun shouted over the rain. "Obinna wasn't the mastermind. He was the fall guy. He was funneling money into your offshore accounts for years. He didn't borrow that money for himself, he borrowed it to cover the tracks of your failed construction company from a decade ago." The crowd of remaining mourners gasped. The golden son hadn't been a villain, he had been a sacrificial lamb, a young man who had spent his entire youth laundering his father's old sins to keep the family from the gutter. The emotional impact hit Adogo like a physical strike. She looked at her husband, the man she had championed as a pillar of industry, and saw the cowardice written in the lines of his aging face. Obinna's knowing smile wasn't a secret of success, it was the silent scream of a son who knew he was dying so his father could live in luxury. Every gift, every trip, and even the silver chain had been a link in a chain of parental betrayal. The sadness was a thick, viscous thing that choked the air. Funk walked past them, her son's small hand in hers, her head held high. She didn't look back at the wreckage of the Nwachukwu name. She had the only thing that was real, the boy with Obinna's eyes, who would grow up far away from the toxic glitter of Lekki. As the handcuffs clicked around Chief Nwachukwu's wrist right there in the cemetery, the sun made a brief, mocking appearance through the clouds. It illuminated the headstone, which simply read, "Obinna Nwachukwu, a son who gave everything." The golden son was gone, and in his wake, he had exposed a life that was nothing more than a beautifully decorated tomb. Adogo stood alone by the mound of fresh earth, the silence of the graveyard finally drowning out the noise of the city. She realized then that death hadn't stolen her son, life had stolen him long ago, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but a 3D, perfect image and a silver chain. The scandal was over, the juicy details were tomorrow's news, but the tragedy was eternal. The mask had finally fallen, but there was no one left to see the face beneath.